just happy to open up the floor and see if anyone wants to share anything that it's their top ideas. Okay, we have. Sorry. Listen. Okay, Karl's got the room mic.
Yeah, so good morning, this is Mohammed from Kuwait. So when I saw the title, so, you know, for me I'm not my English is the second language, so I just Googled so, and they thought that so, you know, for cutting, you know, as a tool. And they said, what the meaning of this? Carbon as a soap. So are they going to use carbon to solve something? You know, the first thought, you know, then when I saw the image you have, I said, oh yeah, it's the soul itself, you know, the sharp edge. So this is, you know, this is my first impression of understanding the piece. I didn't get it until I get yesterday when I saw the kids, you know, playing, and then I said, oh yeah, it's the CS of the carbon. So it's just I want to share this.
Yes, thanks for sharing that. And I suppose I could say that, you know, the powder definitely could be interpreted as a saw as well as a playground equipment. And I think hopefully in either case, whether it looks like an inverted saw and you're looking at the blades, that the waviness gives us that sense of that our time domain, what we're thinking about. Periods of time over reactions.
Hi, I'm Jason at DC State. So I have gotten the impression from talking to some of our more distinguished senior colleagues about how this is something that's been going on for a long time. So last night I read the 1988 DOE Coastal Margins report, which had very similar ideas about looking at transport onto the shelf. This was focused on the East Coast. But I think some of the ideas, maybe the one about floating nuclear power plants wasn't a good one, but some of the ideas people have been thinking about it for a long time. So I think it's worth maybe revisiting some of these older literature and saying now that we have tools and new technologies, how can we build on them?
That's great. That sounds like a nice plug for perhaps a breakout team tomorrow that might want to participate in doing some writing on that synthesis and revisiting these older ideas and seeing how they fit into what we're learning about this. One thing I was struck with yesterday was the time we spent really trying to understand how the physical measurements that are being made by the meteorology and atmospheric communities can provide a nice context with which to look at the time domain. And it also brings in this component of space. And so spatiotemporal changes are probably really what we're after here. But we are, you know, thinking, how can we also incorporate observations that occur over different periods of time? And I was left also with lingering questions on how do you take different time domains, different rates, you know, upscaling and merge disparate data sets and those sorts of things. So I'm trying to also tee us up for today's talks on modeling and observation programs. Anyone continue seesaw discussions last night at dinner, or you have enough? All right. I think we should move. Can we go ahead and move forward? Sounds like we're ready to get into today's discussions. And so, anything, May, if we have any Zoom, anything in the chat to share? Nothing in the chat. Well, I propose we move forward with our day. Oh, sorry. Yes, Karl. Get it right.
Hey, Joel Scott from Mass. So I guess two things that kind of came to my mind from yesterday's discussions were thinking about how we can begin to synthesize things that are common among these different regional domains, and then using that to form a modeling context. But kind of come out of a comment Blake made in our breakout yesterday, which I think would be helpful because it seems like there's a lot of great science understanding a lot of regional systems. But then how do we start identifying commonalities between those that could lead to bigger modeling frameworks? And I think you touched on that in your comment also. And then the second observation I had to get away from it is how do we start to really begin to work together? Because again, we all kind of exist in our own unique niche area. But then I feel like one of the big purposes of this meeting is to bring together all of us with different backgrounds. How do you bring together terrestrial people, coastal people, open ocean people, hydrologists? How do you start making those connections? Not saying that somebody needs to start doing new science, but how do you get them to communicate and join a team to really move things forward when what we're talking about deals with such kind of cross-disciplinary type activities? And so I think that's a really important outcome as well. We start to think, how do we build those partnerships? How do we start taking the momentum we're building here and leveraging that as we go to the future? So anyway, that's just a couple observations there. Sorry, it's the morning and my coffee hasn't quite kicked in, so thank you.
That's right, thank you. In the back.
Thank you. It's Hannah with me in Liverpool. I was just wondering what the outcome of the meeting, is there going to be a follow-up meeting? Will there be any synthesis papers? What kind of synergistic activities we could do? Like, what can we think about we could do after the meeting to make sure that all of this interesting discussion continues? Sort of following on previous comments.
So I love that question and the two comments and questions beforehand, because they sort of hit on what the science organizing committee said could be 3 things we do tomorrow. We figure out who wants to work on building review papers and other synthesis papers or new direction papers. So a group that might be interested in participating in writing, but then also figuring out how do we put together networks of different scientists and get these communities knitted together better. And then, as you just mentioned, thinking also about what are some next steps. That's what we're here for, and that's what I'm hoping we can talk about. Certainly, we can propose follow-on workshops. We can propose special sessions at upcoming meetings, and shortly. That's a good.
How do we get funding?
I don't know.
Rapids are only 200K max. So how do we get funding to do this type of synthesis activity across disciplines, across space, across time? Rapids are reactionary and cap at 200K, but can we advocate for a call to our program officers? Is it through NSF code, which seems really challenging to meet all those requirements, but it seems like we need to build these observation networks really to look at fate and transformation.
And I think we can advocate for that. I think we can write some perspective articles and really push an initiative, and we'll turn it over.
You got this, keep going.
All right. And I was, a little silly about just saying, I don't know, but I think I certainly don't have all of the answers in a prescription of what we can do or where we can go. That's why we're having this is a scoping workshop. But that's absolutely key questions. How do we get this type of effort resourced and sustained? One thought I have had is that we probably need to be talking to our state and even regional agencies to see if there's interest and ability to help support these efforts, maybe on very small scales, and to see how we can integrate those with larger efforts. So one that we talked about briefly yesterday were sea grants. Are there sea grant opportunities that maybe wouldn't be specifically for this, but would these types of activities and observation networks and so forth could be proposed and leveraged. It's just.
So yeah, thank you. And great question. And that's one thing I love about OCB workshops is they bring together NSF and NASA communities. And so, I mean, I think some of us are more familiar with the NSF model, some of us, like myself, are actually working at NASA. But I would encourage you to check out the different calls that NASA puts out in their ROSAs. Right now, there is an interdisciplinary science IDS that's currently out there. There's like 7 subtopics on that. Those are coming up as due really soon, so it might be too late to get it on this cycle, but that does come back periodically. Every 3 years is the cycle there. So that's a good one that you can look at. And then also in ocean biology and biogeochemistry program, we're not a stranger to these topics. We're actually releasing kind of a decadal science vision, releasing it's still up for review, working on getting the reviewers' comments addressed. And in that, there will be 2 chapters that give a lot of relevance to this kind of discussion. One of them is on interfaces. So when you start to think about air meeting ocean, land meeting ocean, and how you have fluxes across that, that's important for us, as well as transient orthophonic events is another element that effectively talking about the same things in this workshop. So it is not a new concept. What we're talking about here is on our radar. And so again, stay tuned for upcoming OBB solicitations, because there may be some topics in there that could be relevant to this kind of. So again, and feel free to always reach out to your program manager. We always love seeing interdisciplinary science, even if the call doesn't specifically say that. Partner with the data scientist, partner with the terrestrial ecologist, partner with the coastal ecologist, partner with the biogeochemist. We love to see that. And even if it's some of those may not necessarily be interdisciplinary, some people even invite me as to whether physical oceanography is a different discipline than biological oceanography, but we like to see a diversity of talent on opposing teams. So again, I think there's definitely space for this and there's awareness of this. So and one thing that I would really love to see, and I'll do a little shameless NASA plug here, is how do we design better observing systems to observe these features? Whether that's in water assets, whether that's suborbital campaigns, whether that's new satellite constellations. And so again, if you have any ideas on those kinds of things, I'm always eager to hear for that. Because again, how do we set up a more encompassing observatory so that we don't miss these events? When you're getting maybe not even one satellite over past a day, it's easy to miss some of the signals associated with these events. But if you have any ideas on how we can better observe that, how we can deploy drones, or how we can build a small sat constellation, any of those types of things, or how we can leverage some of our commercial data partners that NASA has. Those are all ideas that I think are potentially relevant, and I would love to hear more of the community's thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fantastic to hear. As you were going through and sharing all that, I was thinking we have folks, we have international partners here. We're building an international network. So that's something else we should think about. How can we reach out? And you all that are coming from overseas and elsewhere, how can you be the points of contact for those types of efforts? So I think this is another part of it as well. It seems like certainly an international problem. So we can have some agencies.
I assume people have seen the media what's happening in the UK right now with Brexit. This means that at least in the UK, but I think this little bit, Joe probably has know more about this, but there is a little bit of an idea of trying to find money to do projects exactly as say, between Europe and the US. And so there might be very general calls coming up. I've seen a couple that could be useful for this. It might be that you're fighting with, I don't know, medicine and many other things at the same time. But there are at least an ambition to try to build up like bridges between the European and the US side. And how much of that is just discussion and how much of that is actual money on the table. But that is one place where if you have a well thought out project about extreme event, that could fly quite well in that kind of setting, I think. So that's something.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
I just want to follow up a little bit on what Joel said. It's really great to have Joel here. This is a NASA program officer here that, talk to Joel because he has a lot of knowledge about how NASA works and how its funding opportunities work. We did have an NSF program manager on the line yesterday for a little while, but it's unfortunate that we don't have someone here. I think it's important for us, this is step one. This is a long sum game, and community building takes a long time, and OCB plays a big role. NECP plays a big role in building community, and it takes time, and it takes, you know, a workshop here or a special session there, and these things happen, and connections happen, and people write proposals together, and there are emerging opportunities. You know, NASA's been fantastic about, you know, when OCB comes together and has a workshop and a document with recommendations to set science directions comes out of that, it's called out in the NASA call. It's being called out. It's for the second time now in the NASA IDS, interdisciplinary science subset of ROSES. So, you know, the agencies are listening. This is a bottom-up process. You know, that there's not going to be a dedicated extreme events funding program at NSF anytime soon, but you know, we've got core funding programs, and there are a lot of cross-directorate opportunities at NSF that are coming down the line. And I'd really love for us to think as a community at our first gathering here, where do we want to be in 5 to 10 years? You know, do we want to have, you know, some sort of a more operational presence? You know, do we want to have some sentinel sites where we've got some real insights on what it takes to characterize the baseline variability of a system and then assess the impact of storm events or wildfires? You know, this community, from all the different disciplines that we have here in this room, we all bring different assets and different things to the table, so we can amass our knowledge and what we know about what observing assets are out there and start thinking about what there is in place and where we want to be in 10 years. We can start having a conversation about the little mechanisms and bits and pieces of this that we'll tackle a little bit at a time and how we're going to do it. You know, do we need a synthesis of observing assets? Do we need a team of people thinking about sentinel site for a wildfire study? Do we need a team of people doing the same thing for tropical cyclones? Just be thinking about it in little manageable bites and bits and pieces. Some of this work will get done by individual PIs who are, you know, or 3 or 4 teams of PIs who go off and write a cool proposal together. But the community still has to stay vibrant, and we still have to stay together. And that's what OCB and NACP can do together, is keep this community together and alive. And, you know, we see each other at special sessions at AGU or Ocean Sciences, or you propose a working group to OCB to follow on some of the action items that come out of this. There are a lot of different ways to get this done. And I understand that it takes manpower. And that's one thing I can't provide for you with salary support. And I know that's a bummer, but we're here to support that and do whatever we can to make that work happen and facilitate that, you know, taking it that next step forward. You know, when they're, you know, sometimes it just comes down to manpower, and I get that, but I think Libby had found one. Yeah, I just wanted to add, especially since it's been brought up a couple of times about sort of observational networks, and something that I think, you know, still can be explored a lot more, although isn't necessarily a direct funding source in terms of thinking about the other federal agencies that work in this space that don't necessarily have extramural funding, but have the capacity of their own staff scientists to collaborate more. So I'm thinking about like USGS. I know we had, you know, one of the speakers yesterday was from the USGS, but, you know, or Forest Service, or folks from NOAA working in that coastal space that I feel like that's something that in NACP, you know, we keep sort of trying to do to like sort of build more of those cross connections between academia and other sort of research areas. And I think that, you know, places like USGS and Forest Service sort of face their own internal challenges about maintaining observation networks as well, but like perhaps there's something more that we can do as a greater community sort of working across all to, you know, further enhance that effort and work together. So just another thing to think about.
Yeah, we have I mean, Libby and I are the daughter programs to the Carbon Cycle Science Program, right? The U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program, which has a carbon cycle interagency working group.
So all these different agencies come to the table and they have collaborated on funding calls before, so that you can really span the disciplinary breadth of this community to focus on that challenge. So that's something to think about as well.
Yeah, just bringing, I guess, the discussion back to the international collaboration subjects. I've been thinking about that question for a while as well, and how, with funding kind of has to stay internal in many cases if it's taxpayer funding, but how do you go about like synthesizing activities and coordinating? And I've brought this up to a number of people in our organization, CSIRO, and some of our equivalent of DOE as well. And they say, yes, great idea. They want to see a bit more, and kind of thought about how to put that forward. And that might be a good outcome from this, is how a paper is one thing, but also maybe more dynamic front end. And so some examples are the marineheatwaves.org. The SCORE is an example of a couple different other existing working groups that I think we can look at. So I have the pages up now, but again, just kind of collectively thinking of that as an output from this as well. Would be good to get everybody's input on, I think.
Yeah, thank you to everybody. I mean, I think this is exactly what we wanted to hear. What do we have and what can we do? And then we'll go to Hans. And who can we do it with?
Well, it seems like one of the topics, or one of the things that is going on that I think we can focus in on that hasn't really been focused in on in some of the previous synthesis issues, and that is the whole issue of extremes. This is something that the public understands now. We're starting to understand a whole lot better, politicians. And it's also an issue that's impacting almost everywhere, almost everywhere in the world. I'm thinking about the fires in Australia. The fact that Europe is now experiencing hurricane strength storms, that China, Asia, the coast of China, Japan, Korea. So this is something that I think would be a very valuable hook to communicate whatever we put out, that we're really addressing a very dynamic situation on Earth where extreme events and extremism is increasing rapidly. And, it's out there in the newspapers, it's out there in the popular press. All you got to do is read what happened in Florida just, a couple of weeks ago.
There's also something I'm sure a lot of you in this room have heard of, something called an Ocean Climate Action Plan out on the street right now that's looking for information. And the comments are due on the 18th of November. So this group has a powerful opportunity to speak with one voice to kind of create a vision for what we need and what we want for this community. Because extreme events had better damn well be in that Ocean Climate Action Plan. So just a last thought.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I mean, I think this is exactly what we wanted to get out of this morning pre-session before we get into our plenaries. And
There's one comment in the chat. There's a comment in the chat from Simone, and it just says, in Washington, we have successful collaborations across federal and state funded observations and modeling networks with academics involved too. Of course, what would really supersize our efforts would be a data interoperability initiative, along with requisite funding for developing the data harmonizing synthesis capacity across models and data across state and federal data streams across the terrestrial to coastal ocean gradient. Maybe public-private partnerships could help with this too, geos. So sort of similar integration of resources.
And I do think what we're seeing and hearing with all of this is that there are multiple facets that our specific topic reaches out to, and not just at the federal level and within the US. So these are all the threads we want to pull on. And tomorrow is going to be really focused on how this is the team. We're the core right here, our virtual participants, and how do we move forward on multiple fronts. And I'll just close out this here to say that we're not going to address and get to everything, not at all. It's a scoping workshop. So maybe what happens next is we form a working group and we have follow-on workshops and we target, not just ocean sciences, but aquatic sciences, and certainly the next NACP meetings and all of these opportunities to continue pushing this forward. So, all right. Well, thanks for all of that. Let's go ahead and get into our session, and Karl will be our moderator this morning.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karl. Thanks, Athena. I have the pleasure to moderate the modeling session. I've been another modeler. We're needed to you guys, but I'm not wanting to do the storm, so volunteer for the modeling. But getting get started, our first speaker is Julia Moriarty. She's an assistant professor at University of Colorado, Boulder. Please, Julia.
You put that on you. Thanks.
Okay. Well, first, a huge thank you to all of the organizers for putting this together. It's been a lot of fun just to be here in person, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the meeting. So for those of you I haven't met, I'm Julia Moriarty. I'm an assistant professor at University of Colorado in Boulder, and my group focuses on the transport and fate of sediments and nutrients in the coastal ocean. So by that, I mean estuaries, shelves, wetlands, and those types of environments. So when I say coastal, I mean the ocean for this talk. And then I'll mention my collaborators in this talk. All of this work is definitely a group effort, and I'll point them out as their contributions come in. Okay. So we spent a lot of time yesterday talking about terrestrial inputs into the ocean system, right? Storms are, in fact, I think Joe even showed this picture, or sorry, Greg even showed this picture yesterday, right? It's the post-Irene satellite image of, sediment and entering Chesapeake Bay. And storms are notable for that, right? They're generating, whether there's wildfires or not, there's huge inputs of freshwater, sediment, organic matter, and nutrients. However, this material that's entering these coastal systems, if it's entering coastal systems during a storm event, it's also entering an altered ocean environment. So you have large winds driving changes in currents and waves. So driving things like storm surge, driving seabed resuspension. So the entrainment of particles from the seabed into the water column. You're also getting changes in stratification and mixing, as winds mix the water column, and then also you have these river plumes coming out, enhancing stratification. And so all of these processes complicate both the transport and transformations of carbon along this part of the land ocean continuum. Okay. And so as I started my career as a sediment transport. And so one of the things that I really focus on in my work is, how particles are moving around especially during these events. So for anyone not familiar with sediment transport, you get a ton of sediment transport during storms because it's very driven by the shear stresses, which are proportional to velocities to a third. To the squared, but fluxes are proportional to the third. So you get disproportionate impact of events on sediment transport during. So here's one example. This is from Miguel work from the Louisiana Shelf. Here you're looking at the thickness of storm deposits following hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005. And each of these bars, let's see, is that a mouse? Okay. So this is about 15 centimeters of deposition. And one of the things I want to point out is that these are huge, we can't measure the erosion using in this paper, but we're getting a massive mobilization of material and these storm deposits forming that are often, a few tens of centimeters thick that are also spatially variable. So you're also getting places with zero. Also, you're looking at results from two different storms. They're, one is more impacted by the Mississippi River, one is downstream of the Atchafalaya. And so the storms are moving these massive amounts of material around. Here I'm focusing on how the material is being redistributed, right, from one part of the system to another. But in addition, simply by being transported, you're influencing how that organic matter is transformed. And so one of the things that I'll focus on today is how resuspension is altering the biogeochemistry of these coastal waters. And so when you have these storms, you're getting a lot of vertical mixing. So you're mixing both surface and bottom waters, but you're also mixing material from the seabed up into the water column. This moves organic matter from the relatively anoxic seabed into the relatively oxic water column. And it's just this, many of you may be familiar with the idea of the fluidized bed reactor, right? And so this is that. And so you're exposing organic matter to oxygen. It enhances the remineralization rate of the organic matter and also just the sheer amount of material that can be oxidized. Here's a recent, a 2006 study from Stahlberg et al. And one of the things that you can see is simply by what they're doing is they're doing lab experiments where they're resuspending material in the lab and looking at the impact of remineralization. And they saw the CO2 that was produced, they used that as a proxy for remineralization of organic matter. And they saw that increased the remineralization rate by about a factor of 2 to 5. Okay. In addition to that, although I won't talk about it today, is resuspension can directly influence increase the diffusive fluxes of oxygen in the seabed and enhance remineralization there as well. Okay. So, I've given you a lot of this, ideas about how resuspension sediment transport can influence the remineralization of organic matter and also oxygen dynamics. But does that really matter? If you're thinking about, biogeochemistry on a regional scale, how important is that? And so one of the things that motivated when I first started working on this project is some of Katja Fennell's work. So Katja Fennell is a hydrodynamic biogeochemical modeler. She was implementing a model for the Gulf of Mexico. So here in this figure, you're looking at the Louisiana Delta, the Mississippi Delta in Louisiana. This red shading indicates model estimates of hypoxia, and these black dots are the observed estimates of hypoxia, or observed data showing where hypoxia occurs. And one of the things you'll notice, so when she was putting this model together, she ran the same exact model, but she just changed the how the seabed water column interface is parameterized, right? And these are all reasonable assumptions. So if you don't know anything about the site or you don't have a lot of measurement, these are all these choices that she made, these 3 choices would all be reasonable things to do. But depending how you parameterize it, you can get very different estimates of hypoxia, right? And so you can get, these low oxygen areas can vary in where they occur, as well as the sheer magnitude of the oxygen consumption and low oxygen concentrations. And so this is what motivated us to start looking at how in more detail, how sediment transport in that bottom boundary layer is impacting oxygen consumption. I started this work as a PhD student with Courtney Harris and Margie Friedrichs at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. This project was originally funded by NOAA. They wanted to better understand how different physical processes were impacting the Gulf dead zone, or that big area of low oxygenated water on the Louisiana coast. And that project was in collaboration with Katja, as well as Kevin Hsu, Rob Hetland, and Steve DeMarco. And then we pulled in Christophe Rabouillet. So I'll talk about that in a second. This was a very big modeling project, but we really benefited from some of Christophe's observations out in the Rhone Delta. And so we started this project to better look at the physical processes, and specifically for me, sediment transport on hypoxia. However, at the time, there were well-developed communities in hydrodynamics and sediment transport. There was also well-developed communities in hydrodynamic biogeochemical modeling. However, the ability to transport organic matter within the model, especially in those sedimentary processes that are influencing the transport of the organic detritus and organic material that's in the system. And so in order to link these two models together, we started working within the Regional Ocean Modeling System, or ROMS, which is the sort of parent hydrodynamic model, which had previously been coupled to the CSTMS sediment transport model, as well as the phenyl and estuarine carbon biogeochemistry, water column biogeochemistry models. For this talk, I'll be focusing on the phenyl model, for those of you who are familiar with it. And then to link these together, we added in a seabed biogeochemistry component so that we could account for changes to organic matter in the seabed. Now that's a very high level overview. So what were we actually looking at? So we started with the sediment transport model. It accounts for suspended sediment, the adduction and diffusion of that sediment. It also accounts for erosion and deposition to the seabed and a multi-layer seabed model. We also started with the water column biogeochemistry model. So it's an NPZD model. It's the Pachaphenol's model, which accounts for nitrogen as well as organic matter. So photosynthesis, you're accounting for phytoplankton, zooplankton, organic detritus. And then we are also accounting for oxygen. In order to link these two together, we added variables for seabed organic matter and seabed nitrogen and oxygen. So when I say nitrogen in the model context, I'm really talking about nitrate and ammonium. It's a pretty simple nitrogen cycle. And then once we added the variables, we added links to link these models together. So we accounted for, So we accounted for the organic matter in the water column. Not only can it sink to the seabed, but then depending on the waves and the currents, it can be re-entrained into the water column, like eroded into the water column and then redistributed around the shelf once it's suspended. We also accounted for the formation of pore water and the suspension of pore water within those layers, as well as the simple diffusion of nutrients, dissolved nutrients and oxygen between the water column and the seabed. And then, of course, when the material's in the seabed, it's still undergoing biogeochemical changes. So we were accounting for aerobic remineralization, as well as denitrification and anaerobic remineralization as well, and then oxygen, nitrification and oxidation of reduced chemical species. Okay, so we took this model. There's a lot of uncertainty into it. I will come back to some of that later. We took this model, and one of the concerns was that we were funded to do this for the Gulf of Mexico. However, we didn't have observations. So we ended up, as I mentioned, going over to France. So Christophe actually gave this talk, and Christophe actually came up to us after the talk in order to, he's like, you have this model, we have this observations, let's work together. And one of the things that we did is we validated our model with his observations. I'm not showing it here for time, but if you want to see cool movies of oxygen profiles changing during storms, both observationally and models, I would love to show them to you later on. For this talk, I'm going to focus on the Louisiana shelf, which, so this project wouldn't have been possible without our collaborators. So Rob Hatland, in collaboration with Steve DeMarco, set up the hydrodynamic model. Pachaphenol had set up the water column biogeochemical model. Kevin Shu had set up the sediment transport model. And then Laurent had set up the seabed 1D model for some sites on the shelves. And so then we coupled them together and allowed us to look at the impact of sediment transport processes on biogeochemistry. We implemented this model for a 2-year period, 2006 through 2007. here, but specifically we focused on these early summer periods when hypoxia was forming and being maintained on the shelf. Although I'll come back later on in the talk to this fall of 2007, because Hurricane Humberto, I think it's this one, and I'll come back to that a little bit later in the talk as well. And the time period, though, that I'll focus on first was characterized by some small storms, but no hurricanes. One of the things that this coupling allowed us to do was to better represent this near bed particulate organic carbon in the model. So here what you're looking at are model estimates of particulate organic carbon and millimole carbon per meter cubed. And you can see that there's a lot of variability when you're in shallow waters, but it decreases with water depth. And we got a similar, there's definitely places to improve, but we got at least a similar trend compared to the observations. We were getting this large variability in shallow waters and then decreasing with water depths as bed stresses decrease. But without resuspension, I'll show you in a second. Like these POC values are all down here, and you don't get this near bed peak of organic matter at all. And so now what I'm going to look at is, so I described how we set up the model, but how much of an impact did this resuspension and redistribution of organic matter have? So we ran the model twice. First, we ran a standard model with everything I just described. And then we also ran one additional model run where we just prevented we ran more than one additional model run, but the one I'm going to show you is just one model run where it's exact same, but there was no resuspension. We prevented that from occurring in the model. And I'll be showing results from this cross-shelf transstack downstream of the Atrophilia that's shown here, that blue line in the bottom right. And so to orient you, here's, this transect is right here. And so you can see if you're looking at the organic carbon, it's high in the shallow areas, right? You're getting various waves, preferentially resuspend material on shallow areas because they decay with water depth. And then you're getting it's sort of mid-shelf resuspension of some deposited material that was deposited likely from the Mississippi River plume. Okay. So if you then take that and you compare these two model runs, so the model run with resuspension, the model run without resuspension, to isolate the impact of that on water column biogeochemistry. So you can see that most of the organic matter in the water column is due to resuspension. This is all positive, right? So if you turn off resuspension, the material stays deposited. Once it's deposited, it can't be resuspended. And so you get an increase in in POC. Therefore, you get an increase in remineralization rate. So the remineralization rate is high both near the bed, where you're getting this near bed peak of organic matter. It is also high up here because you're getting this really labile, so you have a lot of phytoplankton growth near the surface. It's very labile organic matter, and so it has a relatively high remineralization rate. And so you're getting a peak right below that as well, and sort of right here. However, the change due to resuspension, of course, is more isolated in the seabed because that's where you're getting this increase in particulate organic carbon due to resuspension. So this project was motivated by hypoxia. So what was the influence on oxygen concentrations? So overall, you're getting this decrease. So oxygen concentrations are lowest near the seabed, and then they're higher up in the water column. And then you're getting this negative change in oxygen concentration. So oxygen concentrations are decreasing as you're getting this enhanced remineralization during these events. Okay. And this played out across the shelf. And I will say that the oxygen signal is more diffuse just because oxygen diffuses and it's not settling as much as particles. So this signal was consistent across the shelf, which is something I'll come back to later in the talk when I talk about the Chesapeake Bay, because it wasn't, there's a lot more spatial variability there. One thing is sort of for the little bit of small font, I added this in last minute after yesterday's presentation, but I wanted to show, we've been talking about lags and legacies, especially in my breakout group yesterday. And so here what you're looking at is sort of the time frame over which these changes are affecting the water column biogeochemistry. And so here, these gray and black lines, it's from the standard model run. These red lines are from the no resuspension model run. So you have during these sort of two smaller events, you're getting high bed stresses. That's resuspending the particulate organic carbon in the standard model run. Of course, there's very little POC in the no resuspension model run. And that's increasing your remineralization and drawing down oxygen, increasing ammonia. However, it does, while the POC and remineralization rates go down almost immediately, right, as material settles out of the water column during these calmer periods, it's a longer tail until the oxygen and ammonium go back to normal. Overall, what was the impact of this on water column biogeochemistry? So if you average over a month, this 2-month period, about 2/3 of the near bed oxygen consumption in the model was due to this entrainment of POC into the water column and the remineralization associated with that. But one of the neat things is, we didn't have a whole lot of observations. It's very difficult to measure these in the ocean, right? But at the same time, totally unbeknownst to us, Laura Bianucchi at the Department of Energy was thinking about this similar problem. And so I, by this time, had moved on. I was at the Geological Survey, but she contacted us and was like, looking, they had seen something similar in the observations. And it turns out they got the same. I was very happy to see this was on the same order of magnitude, that they saw 20% of the near bed oxygen consumption was accounted for by this remineralization of organic matter during storms, which compared well with our 2/3 estimate. And so just to talk a little bit more about this, and she did this work while she was at the Department of Energy. She's now at Fisheries and Oceans Canada. But just to talk a little bit more about this, they did a meta-analysis and they looked at how much oxygen declined following storms. And basically, if you have the same stratification before or after a storm, you get much more drawdown of oxygen after the storm, or 20% more. And so they attribute that to this increase in total suspended solids and the remineralization of the organic matter that's in the system during storms. And then to complement that, we did the same analysis that I just showed you, but during Hurricane Humberto. So we also saw that, as when you get this large increase of POC in the water column, you're getting an increase in remineralization that's drawing down oxygen concentration. This is actually not as strong of a signal. And then that's more than following the storm, it's more than balancing that mixing of oxygen into the bottom layer from increased vertical mixing. Okay. So if you remember nothing else from the first part of the talk, we saw that when and where you're getting increased organic matter remineralization, you're getting this drawdown of oxygen. And so the next part of this project, we started working in the Chesapeake Bay. This was a NASA-funded project working with Martin Friedrichs, and who actually, forgot to acknowledge on the slides, but they were interested in Chesapeake Bay biogeochemistry. And so our question was, are we going to see the same thing? This is a very different system. The Louisiana shelf is pretty, relatively flat, very open. You're getting, estuarine circulation under the river plume, but it's a very different system than Chesapeake Bay, which is shallow shoals, deep channel, and you're getting the hypoxia is really constrained to the channel because of stratification. And so we did the same thing. We ran the model with and without resuspension. And one of the things that we saw is that it wasn't as simple in this type of system. So when you include resuspension, you're getting increased light attenuation. That makes sense. This is near the estuarine turbidity maximum. That's pushing your primary production. So your phytoplankton growth, you're pushing that further downstream because the increased turbidity in the ETM is pushing your the phytoplankton growth downstream. And then that in turn causes this particulate organic carbon to also, the signal to also be shifted downstream. So by turning on resuspension, the dominant impact was not this solely near bed process. It was this pushing of the primary production downstream that pushed where the locus of particular organic carbon downstream as well. It also allowed more organic matter to settle out closer to the bay mouth and then be transported up this way. And our remineralization rates were similar to the POC concentrate, similar in the spatial patterns to the POC concentrations. But one of the really interesting things is that although we see this upstream downstream shift in primary production and organic matter concentrations and remineralization, is we didn't really see the oxygen. We got decreased oxygen. And so why is that? It's because of the decreased up here where the water column is well mixed. We're seeing this, the main signal in the oxygen was from this decreased photosynthesis, right? So if you're getting less photosynthesis, less primary production, you're getting less oxygen production. So if with resuspension, you're lowering that photosynthesis, you're getting less oxygen. However, where you're in more of a stratified water column, you're also experiencing increased photosynthesis and primary production. In the surface waters, you actually get an increase in oxygen because that's where you're getting more photosynthesis. But as that material settles, it increases the remineralization down here and increases oxygen below the picnic line in the Chesapeake Bay. And so we got decreased oxygen everywhere in bottom waters in Chesapeake Bay, even though you have the spatially variable impact on primary production and remineralization. Okay, so one of the things that, there's a lot of, I often call this affectionately the kitchen sink modeling approach. You're trying to put everything in one model, right? And so one of the things that's always you have to think about when you're running these models is how sensitive is it to different parameters, right? And so one of the things that came out of this is that the models, in addition to just returning resuspension on and off, the model was very sensitive to how long organic matter was staying in the water column and how labile it was, right? And so if you change your rates, here you're looking at estimates of remineralization. Sorry, I was talking to geologists for this. So this is remineralization rate, oxygen concentrations, and hypoxic area for these different model runs. So you have standard model run here. When you turn off resuspension, you get a lower remineralization rate, higher oxygen concentrations, and lower hypoxic area. And then if you change the settling velocities, these is all changed the parameters by a factor of 5, you get these increases and decreases in your remineralization rate and oxygen concentrations as well, because you're just controlling how long that organic matter stays in the water column. And similarly, if you assume the material is less or more labile, then you also get changes in remineralization and oxygen. And so one of our takeaways from this is how long particles are in the water column matters for the near-bed biogeochemical dynamics in the system. And so we're actually going to skip forward a couple of years in terms of work. I did a postdoc, but then I came back to this. And one of the things I'm working on now is this newly funded project. It's in my part of the project is to look at how long particles are resuspended for and how that influences or disturbs deposits of organic carbon in the seabed. And specifically, this is actually a program with computer science. So I think in the comments, like in the discussion before my talk, right, we talked about interoperability between different data sets and models. And so this project actually aims to address some of those issues by developing easier ways to access multiple kinds of data sets. And then I'm using some of those methods to pull commonly available data sets to be able to try to estimate how long and in what conditions particles are resuspended for in different systems where there may or may not be a lot of data available. And so we're reading in data sets from WaveWatch 3, DB seabed, hydrodynamic models, and using that to estimate how long particles are suspended and exposed to oxygen. And if you're curious about data components and a little bit more about what we're doing, I'm happy to talk with you about some of that. But just in terms of this talk, we're interested in carbon. We're an OCB workshop. And so overall, resuspension is accounting for about 3/4 or more of oxygen exposure in these coastal systems like the Louisiana Shelf and Rhone River Delta, which is one of our preliminary sites. Okay, and finally, I'm going to wrap up in a sec, but just there's also some ongoing work if you're interested in POC transport along the Arctic land ocean continuum, or Tina Geller, my PhD student, has a poster on residence time of water and nutrients in Arctic lagoons. I encourage you to reach out. And I think I'm short on time, so I'm going to skip on that. And then finally, to wrap up, so in conclusion, we've developed a coupled hydrodynamic sediment transport biogeochemistry model that accounted for resuspension and transport of particulate organic carbon or matter, as well as seabed pore water. And we use this model to look at the impact of resuspension and sediment transport during events on near-bed biogeochemical processes, specifically oxygen consumption, but also the remineralization rates of organic matter. And we saw the largest impact when and where POC concentrations were high. So if you're getting convergence of material or where you're getting the most resuspension, that's where this mattered the most. And it could account overall from preliminary results from this new project indicate that the amount of time that set particles, including organic matter, is exposed to oxygen, that resuspension is accounting for most of the time that the organic matter is exposed to oxygen and therefore might be undergoing faster remineralization. Some broad scale comments. So overall, coupled numerical models can be a useful tool for estimating the role of especially difficult to measure processes in the marine system, right? One of the reasons we were, these are just very hard processes to measure, going out during storms, being near the seabed. And one of the ways models can complement observations is trying to look at the role and the uncertainty in what we don't know and how it might estimate what we're seeing. And they can also account for some of the spatial and temporal variability in the system. And then finally, a variety of model approaches and complexities are useful. So one of the papers we read was, talking about how we can't do this kitchen sink approach in every system, right? And so developing reduced complexity approaches that we can apply to a variety of systems is useful as well. And thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Questions? Kind of running a little late, maybe one more.
Julia, just a quick question on the organic matter. You sort of assume, sedimentary for ECU, East Carolina University. For the organic matter, you're assuming a certain amount of organic carbon, right? Like with a certain degradation constant. Is that correct?
I'm assuming a certain like remineralization rate constant for different classes of organic matter. So you might be familiar with like the, often people assume like the labile, refractory, and inert portion. So we don't really model inert, we just group it in with the sediment, but we do account for labile and refractory, like two different classes of organic matter, each of which has an associated remineralization rate constant, as well as, a settling velocity critical shear stress like sediment. And also would have a different end to seep ratio as well. Did that answer your question? Okay. We aren't assuming a certain, I guess we're assuming a certain, we initialize the model with a certain organic content in the seabed. Then once we do that, we're not assuming a certain organic matter concentration anywhere. We would use that to validate the model. Does that make sense? Okay.
Right, thank you. All right, we're moving on to our next speaker, Doug Hamilton. He's an assistant professor at North Carolina State University, and he will give us a perspective on her system models.
Great, thank you very much. So let's start by thanking the organizers for putting on this workshop. So I actually only just arrived in Raleigh a month ago myself, so yes, I'm a assistant professor, but this is all very new to me, so I'm very excited to kind of start off my time here at NC State by participating in this workshop. Most of what I'm going to show you today is the work that I undertook at Cornell, and that was with a wide variety of collaborators, from ocean scientists to paleo scientists, observationalists, and landfire ecologists. And I'm approaching the topic of wildfires and aerosol deposition in terms of their nutrient supply to the open ocean from an atmospheric science point of view, using global Earth system models. So this talk is going to kind of move away from the coastal region to the oceans. But as I was hearing yesterday, there might be some similarities as well as many differences. So I'm kind of excited to learn a little bit more about what they are. So I just want to start, first of all, with exploring some of the evidence that exists that aerosol deposition is in fact important when we're thinking about NPP and marine biogeochemical cycles. So here what we're looking at is a compilation of all of the artificial bioassay experiments that we could find in the literature that was published. This figure was published this year. So we had 70 different studies that we found. And then when we look across all of those different studies, we see that, yes, indeed, if you add aerosol to these bioassay experiments, on average, it would suggest that there is a positive increase in the amount of chlorophyll A that you're getting after the aerosol addition. However, in 40% of the studies, there is either no increase actually in the chlorophyll which is measured, or there is a negative response. So if we look at the picture here, the blue represents positive increases, and in the red we see the negative increases. And sometimes they can actually be in very similar regions where you're seeing no increase, or you're seeing a negative increase, as where you may see a positive increase another time if you go and sample then. So when we're thinking about these kind of external perturbations or forcings to biogeochemistry that's coming through, it's not always that those perturbations are obviously going to have a positive or healthy benefit. Quite often, in fact, it might well be the opposite. I put up some of the reasons why you might not get a response there to think about. But one of the nice things about having such a large data set is that we can also break it down by aerosol type and ask the question, do different aerosol types have a different impact on the biogeochemistry? And yes, this data set would suggest potentially so, that aerosols from an anthropogenic source may well be stimulating productivity at a higher rate than aerosols maybe from the dust source. We do also have 2 volcanic sources in here, but I don't think that's really maybe enough samples to actually kind of come to any sort of conclusions. But when we're thinking about the differences between the dust and anthropogenic, there's many reasons why this might be the case, including the fact that anthropogenic aerosols are smaller, they're often more labile, and mineralogy can be different. So the bioaccessibility of those nutrients could be different between these different sources. But this is very much a new and emerging kind of topic, and we still have a lot of questions to actually ask as to, are different aerosol sources impacting biogeochemistry in different ways, and why might that actually be? So bioassays are great for a small contained experiment, but if we're thinking about the ecosystem scale, that has different responses. So I just want to briefly touch on the very famous kind of iron experiments where people went out in the ships and the tankers and they just chucked all the iron over the side of those ships and then measured the change in chlorophyll. And again, yes, at the ecosystem kind of basin scale, we might be expecting to see a change in net prime productivity if you're adding iron to different ocean regions. And the red dots here represent where you're actually getting a response from these iron experiments in the productivity. And that's kind of classified as those classic high nutrient, low chlorophyll regions, which are the North Pacific, the Equatorial Pacific, and the Southern Ocean. Certainly from an Earth system modeling perspective, the story doesn't end actually when we're thinking about the impact on the Earth system with just the change in the productivity or the ecosystem response in response to the aerosol deposition. So I just want to go through a little feedback cycle here, which starts with the nutrient aerosols at the top of the box. So the nutrient aerosols can be released into the atmosphere. And during transport, what happens is some of these mineral versions of the nutrients, so things like iron and phosphorus, they can actually undergo chemistry, which increases their labile fraction, or that's the fraction which is most likely to be bioaccessible to the phytoplankton. After deposition, yes, that can change ecosystem productivity. And then in the context of this workshop, the interesting is then the impact on CO2 sequestration. But also at the same time, if you change your productivity, you're changing the amount of biological biological gases, which are being emitted by these phytoplankton, which get released back into the atmosphere. That then readily condenses into things like sulfate and organic aerosols, which modify cloud processes and climate, which can then feed back again if it's going to be changing things like precipitation rates or local temperatures, particularly if those changes are over the land. We can then feed all the way back around to changing the amount of nutrient aerosols again that you're releasing, and so the cycle kind of carries on. So it's a full kind of Earth system feedback here, which is where one of the strengths of system modeling kind of comes in, because it can kind of tease out the strengths of some of these links when we're thinking about what's important, particularly under climate change. So for this talk, I want to really now focus in on the contribution of wildfires to the nutrient aerosol loading. And I just want to start with this ternary diagram. And here we're looking at a comparison of the emissions from different aerosol sources to three major nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron. What we can see is that for the total nitrogen down the bottom here, that's really being dominated by the pyrogenic source, which is the combination of anthropogenic and fire sources. And the vast majority of those nitrogen emissions are actually coming from the anthropogenic component. However, that's not to discount wildfires, because they can be important in some regions, and I'll loop back around to one example of that later. And then when we're looking at the mineral nutrients, so that's our iron and phosphorus, for the total amount of those two nutrients being emitted to the atmosphere, that's really dominated by dust. But what's important here is to think about this soluble fraction, or the bioavailable, bioaccessible fraction. And when we're looking at the differences in sources here, we can see, in fact, that the anthropogenic and fire sources and unnatural sources are actually very important, shouldn't be discounted. In particular, for the soluble iron fraction, the wildfires can actually be the dominant source in many regions. So this is why it's important to be thinking beyond dust, which is what's been done for an awful lot of the last 20, 30 years when we're thinking about aerosol deposition, to be including these other aerosol sources. So what actually is in the smoke plumes then when we're thinking about the nutrients? So here's a schematic here, which shows how the fires can change the nutrient aerosol loading as a function of time. It's going to focus in, first of all, at the first plume on the left-hand side. And conceptually, we can think about this nutrient aerosol coming from two different sources within the fire. You have the combustion of the actual material itself, so the plants, and the amount of iron which might be contained within that biomass. But also the pyroconvection of the fire itself can entrain the local soils and the local dust from the environment, and that also ends up in the smoke plume. So we want to ask the question of how much the relative contribution of both of those two components may be to the nutrients that we're actually observing in that smoke plume then. And the way we did that was to have a look at enrichment factors. So here I'm using the example of iron. And what we did is we had a look across 16 different observational fire campaigns over the last 20 to 30 years, and from a wide variety of different biomes from different continents. And we compared the iron to aluminium ratio that was observed within those plumes and compare that to the crustal iron to aluminium ratio. And if you look at that enrichment factor, it would suggest that in fact about 2/3 of the iron that we're actually observing within these plumes isn't from the plant material, but is in fact coming from the local soils. And that's important because these two different types of iron will have very different physical and chemical properties depending on which way it's actually being entrained. And then the second part is once you've had the fire, it will remove some of the vegetation coverage, which creates a bare soil, so which are much more erodible, and then you can get easier alluvion uplift of the dust from that soil until the vegetation has recovered. There was some interesting talks yesterday as well about how the fire dynamics and the heat may actually change the soil characteristics as well, which would be kind of interesting to think about in terms of changing global fire activity. Just last week, in fact, some authors, you and Jinu, just had a quick look at this, well, not quick look, a very detailed look, in fact, at this by They went across the last 20 years of satellite records, identified 150,000 large fire events, and then looked to see if they could see increased dust after that. And yes, indeed, they suggest that maybe just over half of these large fire events are followed by a large dust event. Unsurprisingly, when they broke this down by biome, they found it was the savanna regions that this was mainly happening in. And of course, that would be because it's much easier and requires less less fire to remove grasses than it does to remove a forest. And that these dust events after the fires will last longer in those savanna events as well. So there's this double impact that we need to think about when we think about fires: the direct impact, which is the smoke itself and the nutrients that are in there, but also this legacy impact on the land surface until it's fully kind of recovered. So now we know or have an inkling that fires and other sources are important for biogeochemistry. We wanted to have a look. I want to quantify how much that different sources are being deposited to different ocean regions. So we developed a dedicated ion aerosol processing module, which is being embedded within the community Earth system model. Just briefly, it contains sources of dust, fire, and anthropogenic ion. We're actually adding volcanic aerosol source at the moment. And critically, it also contains these ion processing within the atmosphere. So that's the chemistry undergoing acidic or organic chemistry, which increases the lability of the ion during transport. And in that way, this ion aerosol module is actually coupling these different parts of the Earth system model, so the atmosphere, the land, and the ocean, to try and tease out some of these couplings that I was showing earlier on. So this model, MIMI, has been used in many studies, but in the context of the extreme event for this workshop, I just want to focus mainly on the Australian megafire of 2019-2020. So what we want to do, first of all, is to understand whether or not the ion models are actually able to capture the amount of ion which is coming from a wildfire source for Australia. So we looked across 3 different models, 2 versions of my model, the MIMI model, using different estimates of the fire emissions. It's a large uncertainty actually in how much fire is being emitted. And then we also wanted to look across the structural uncertainty as well. So we have the Japanese model in here too. So we've got 3 different models that we're comparing, a multi-model mean, and we're comparing that to observations that colleagues took in Tasmania, in Hobart, from Mount Wellington. And from those observations, they were able to pick out the days which are mainly dominated by a fire signal, by having a look at the levoglukazan signal within their observations. And what I'm showing here, I want just to focus in on the black boxes, is the comparison of the observations on those fire days to what the model is predicting in terms of the soluble ion and total ion magnitude on those same fire days, and the solubility at the end, which is just the division of the soluble ion by the total ions. And what we can see is, yes, in fact, the models do seem to be able to well represent the amount of ion which is coming on these fire days. So from here, we have some level of certainty that we can then try and understand what the impacts of that ion might be on the ocean biogeochemistry. So I ran the Pisces model, which is an ocean biogeochemistry model, and we forced it with one of the realizations of the MIMI model. We ran 2 simulations with Pisces model. We ran it once where it was taking in the atmospheric deposition from the dust and the anthropogenic aerosol sources. Then we ran a second simulation where we've got the dust, anthropogenic, and fire sources, so that the difference of the 2 can tell you the change in the productivity due to the fires. And that's what we're looking at here. For each of the years from 2003 to 2020, and we're focusing in only on the Southern Ocean, which is broadly defined here between 30 to 65 north. And we're just looking at fire season, so it's just January and February for those 2 years. Now, each point within our PDS for each different year is the change in prime productivity for each model grid cell within that region at that time. So, and the black line is then the mean change in that prime productivity due to just the addition of the ion from the fire aerosol. And we look at the very top here, which is 2020, where the mega fire happened, and we can see that the model is predicting there's about a 3% increase across the whole Southern Ocean in terms of fire productivity, which is anomalous compared to most other years and is large. But at the same time, as we were looking at this from the modeling point of view, many people were looking at the Australian wildfires and asking questions about it. And some other colleagues were looking at it from the satellite and ocean biogeochemistry Argo flow point of view. When they're looking at it from the observations, what they estimated was in fact that there will be a 20% increase in the net primary productivity due to that wildfire addition. So this opens up some interesting questions about why are we getting a different response in the models compared to potentially a larger response in what's being seen in the observations. Some of that can be down to, are we mischaracterizing the actual aerosol loading within the atmospheric part, or is the biogeochemistry models which have been parameterized and set up really in a way which has been thinking about it in terms of dust as compared to the different properties that wildfire aerosol might actually have, and maybe they can need some more development as well to kind of tie this together. Also within that particular paper from Tang et al., I think this is kind of fascinating, so I just wanted to kind of put it up here. They also linked the changes in net primary productivity very basically to the export potential. And what they actually suggested as a hypothesis here is that the amount of carbon which was sequestered was in fact equal to and opposite to the amount of CO2 which was actually emitted from the fires themselves. Now, if that's true, and I think there's a lot more investigation and unpacking to do to think about the hypothesis, but if it is true, it really represents a very much a different change in the way that we think about how the carbon cycle is actually kind of working. So I briefly want to just say that it's not always an iron question, and it's not necessarily a Southern Ocean question. Just really quickly to say that we had another study out recently, which was linking again a large phytoplankton bloom to a large wildfire event. But this time it's for the Arctic Ocean, and this time it's for the nitrogen deposition. So it's nitrogen limited in the Arctic Ocean. And the key thing about this study was that the only way that we could reconcile with the models the amount of nitrogen that would be required to sustain the bloom was to consider the source of nitrogen from peat burning. So in the Arctic region, the permafrost is melting, which is releasing or making the peat available to be able to burn. And that's another kind of question when we're thinking about climate change in terms of changing ecosystems. If this peat, which has got a lot of nitrogen in it, is going to burn more in the future, but what does that mean for the kind of delicate balance of the Arctic ecosystem if it's going to be receiving a lot more nitrogen input from the atmosphere? So I actually changed the second half of my talk last night, given some of the discussions that happened yesterday. So we're going to shift a little bit away now towards the temporal question. So the number one thing that came up, I think from the participants, was this question of the degree of human alteration to the landscape. So I want to touch on that a little bit from the wildfire perspective, and then link it back again to this kind of nutrient deposition. So when we're thinking about the human alteration to wildfires and the aerosol burden, there's many kind of processes and things to think about, some of which I've tried to conceptualize here in this Venn diagram. But it is really important that we do consider all of these and not focus particularly on one of them. And the example as to why we need to kind of be thinking about the full extent of how human activity is in fact altering fires is if we go back to the pre-industrial period, depending on how much complexity in the question of how much the human is altering fires and the landscape will give you a very different answer into how much fire emission there was in the past. So here what we're looking at in the black line, the solid black line is the present day fire emissions integrated latitudinally. In the gray line, we have the CMIP6 estimates. That's what's used in the latest IPCC report. And you can see that basically it kind of follows the black line. So the pre-industrial fires, according to CMIP6, are in fact very similar to the present day. It hasn't been much change in fire activity over time. Now, if you look back to an earlier reconstruction of past fires, which is in the orange line, and all that did in that particular one, that was Aerocon's estimate, they just related fires to population density. So they had no other pieces of information there. And if you do that, you end up with fires in the past which are much lower than the present day. However, if you start to include things around active and passive fire suppression, which includes the way that we use land, as well as actually going out and putting out the fires, in particular the change to agricultural land, which creates and creating roads, which create barriers to fire spread, and you start including that information within these reconstructions, what you end up with is a lot more fire in the past. So the green line here is one model simulation, which does include active and passive fire suppression. You can see particularly for the northern mid hemispheres, where we are in America and Europe, there's a lot more fire in the past than in the present day, which might sound a bit counterintuitive when we're thinking about the news and what we hear all the time about like extreme events and how much fire we have and how this is like much larger. But that's because we're looking over a time period of a couple of decades as compared to actually looking back to this pre-industrial kind of period. And then if you add in agricultural land practice burning in the past as well, you get to the blue line, and then you end up with a lot more fire in the past. So I don't have time really to dig into verification of this, but just to say we looked at a whole suite of different paleo environmental archives, and indeed the two high fire estimates agreed best with those paleo environmental archives, different for different regions, depending on which one's doing better, but in no place does the CMIP6 actually come out the best. So this highly suggests that yes, fires were larger in the past than in the present. So what does that mean in terms then of soluble iron deposition? Well, if we look by different ocean basins, in the northern hemisphere, we still, even though we've got less fires, we still end up with more iron being deposited to the ocean, and that's due to an increase in dust and then this anthropogenic combustion, which is creating an awful lot of iron, and the combination of those two increases dwarfs the reduction that we're seeing from the fires. But in the southern hemisphere, where we have less dust and less industrial activity, we're actually getting a lot less iron predicted to be deposited to the Southern Ocean in particular. And that matters because that whole region is iron limited and a lot of where the CO2 export is actually happening. So we can also think about the question for the future as well, and what will happen in the future. I haven't got time to show what model predictions are predicting for the future, but if anyone's interested, please come and have a chat with me. I'm doing a lot of work on that at the moment to try and create some holistic future projections, which include climate as well as human activities impacts on fires. But basically, if you do it, you end up with a very, very large increase in fires in the Southern Hemisphere and just a very minor decrease in the Northern Hemisphere. And that the Northern Hemisphere decrease is mainly related to Air Pollution Quality Acts, actually. So what does that mean for these kind of changes over time for the biogeochemistry? I'm just focusing on the carbon cycle here, but we did this also for the nitrogen cycle. If we look at the change in time, we can put these different fluxes into an ocean biogeochemistry model and compare the impacts on net prime productivity and other components between the two time periods. This time I'm using a slightly different ocean biogeochemistry model, the BEX model, but it's basically doing the same kind of thing. So we've got the soluble iron flux in the top, the change in productivity between the present day and pre-industrial and the future 2100 compared to the present day. We can see actually, again, we're not really seeing very big changes in productivity estimated by the model. But the next one down, which I think is quite interesting, is the change in the community shift. So the model predicts, in fact, that the communities will shift towards larger diatoms if you are changing the aerosol loading. And that means that there's a bigger impact actually then on the export production potentially than we're going to see just in the prime productivity itself. So we can play with this in a slightly different way within the model as well, not just look at the cumulative impact of changing all different sources over time, but what's the impact of each different source itself on the marine biogeochemistry. And that's what we did here. So we're also looking at what the impact of more dust, more fires, or more anthropogenic iron would be for different ocean basins under an assumption of what those emissions, the uncertainty and the emissions exist. And if you don't take home any other particular message from today, the kind of take home message here is that when we did that, we actually found that carbon export in the model is a factor of 9 times more efficient for the fire iron than for the dust iron. So that means that every gram of iron that you're putting in from a fire source, we're getting 9 times more CO2 sequestered than from the dust source in the model. At the same time, other people from Japan, Moriarty was also doing this exact same study using their models, and they found basically the same answer as well. And that was a factor of 6. Now, this also doesn't contain any of the differences in the physical properties between these aerosols within these biogeochemistry models at the moment, which I was alluding to earlier, might be important when we were thinking about that case study of Australia, where we were seeing much higher response, in fact, to the wildfires than what the models are predicting. So if that was the truth as well, then maybe this is actually an underestimate. So at the very end of the review paper that we did this year, which brought together a whole wide variety of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary colleagues, these were what we felt as a community were the future issues in terms of aerosol nutrient deposition and the impacts on biogeochemistry. So I'm not going to read them out because everyone can just read them. But at that point, I'll just be happy to take any questions now.
Thank you. Very comprehensive talk. Sid Mitra, ECU. I might have missed it, but what did you say your assumptions were for aerosol size from pyrolysis, and how much was going vertically as a result of size fractionation, and how much was, it's a continuum, obviously. So what were some of those parameters?
Yeah, so in the model, we have 3 different aerosol classes. We have the Aitken size, accumulation, and course size. Pyrogenic sources are mainly within the accumulation mode, but there are some coarse aerosol particles as well. So we look across all the observations to work out what that fraction is for each different nutrient, and then that's explicitly modeled within the modal aerosol framework. And we include the vertical component from the pyroconvection as well, actually at point of emission too. So all that information is included within the model. And then during evolution and the transport within the model, the aerosol sizes can change due to coagulation, condensation, as well as dry and wet deposition processes, which could be precipitating out, particularly for the dry ones, the coarser, larger aerosol particles. So you're going to get a full change across space. So yes, Aitken. Aitken.
Hi, this is Hans from UNC. This is probably a naive question for the aerosol presentation. What's the difference between soluble iron and aerosol? Because you gave sort of, sometimes you showed soluble, sometimes aerosol. Can you enlighten me on that?
Yeah, so it's all aerosol, but the soluble is the fraction of that total aerosol burden, which we're classing as the bioavailable, bioaccessible fraction. That's also the part, the soluble fraction, if you are looking at the observations where they've gone and done the leaching experiments, that is extracting that soluble fraction, and that's what we're comparing to in the observation. So aerosol is everything, and soluble is still, in fact, part of the aerosol population. It's just a particular subset which we're interested in identifying because it's bioaccessible, what we believe to be the bioaccessible fraction.
Hi, this is Shirley from the University of Colorado. I wanted to follow up on Hans's question about these leaching experiments. Sometimes solubility or this readily available iron in aerosols or dust, they're just determined by dissolution to distilled water. But we know that there is a microlayer that's sitting on top of the ocean that will likely, you can form ligands that attach to the iron, and then your pH also in the surface ocean will be quite different than it is in DI. So I'm wondering whether if you accounted for that in your model, or if you change that solubility, it would maybe match the 3 or 20% difference in that primary productivity in the Southern Ocean.
This is a wonderful question. So this is exactly where I think we need to kind of go. In fact, so yes, you're right. And so the observations or the laboratory experiments leaching protocols are actually undertaken under a wide variety of different leaching, not just distilled water. They do seawater. They do various different levels of acidic bleaching, which could lead to very different answers. So we've actually got a working group together, a school working group, we just got funded, and in fact to have a look at that particular part of the question. And so all the observations kind of come together and harmonize the data set so that when the modelers come and use it, we just have one data set which has relevance to us, because at the moment we're kind of using different numbers and they may not be exactly the same thing. So that, to answer one part of that, yes, there is differences there, and we're starting to tackle that soon. And the second part is the ligands. So the ocean biogeochemistry model does contain ligands itself. I think what is interesting there in terms of that kind of organic question is in fact that the aerosols, when they're coming in, they're not just bringing iron, but they are in fact bringing organics as well with them, particularly from the fires. So a more realistic representation of what the aerosols are actually depositing to the ocean and the way that the ocean models are kind of picking this up. So this is really a task, I think, for the atmospheric models and the ocean models to work together better and understand what's happening across the air sea interface in a little bit more detail, particularly from the organic question. I think it's a really nice way to kind of think about exploring this in a little bit more detail and understanding why we might be getting some of these responses.
Jeff Cross, Stubbound. With the model, what's the time domain of the increased kind of sequestration? So, I mean, these systems in the HMLC environment are, they get these pulses of iron, and that, it seems like it shouldn't just go in and out quickly. They need to recycle it quickly. So, basically, what's the time scale of these responses? And do you feel that, if I interpret it correctly, a lot of that excess sequestration is because you pulse that on productivity? Did I interpret that correctly, or is this export being driven by other metrics?
Okay, so yes, within the model, it's not just that as soon as you put the iron in, that it's all just creating productivity, which deposits out. There is remineralization and sort of factors to keep the iron around, and then a small, very small percentage of that is what actually gets lost to the ocean sediment. So it's not like a 100% case. The export potential increase that we were seeing, particularly in the last one that I was showing, the VEX model, was also to do with this kind of community shift as well. So when we were adding the wildfire iron, what we were seeing was that change to the diatoms. The community was shifting towards the larger, heavier phytoplankton, which were being able to deposit out at a faster rate than the smaller phytoplankton, which were therefore. So that's why we were kind of getting, not necessarily a pulse, I would say, but we were seeing a community shift towards larger, heavier phytoplankton, which can be lost from the system at a faster rate.
Hi, this is Mohammed with University. So basically what you're saying is that more wildfire, there's less, more wildfire, there's more dust storms or dust in the area. So have you observed like a reduction in typhoons in the region? Like, as storms are linked to each other, or extreme events are linked to each other, or something like this?
Okay, that's way out of my sorry.
Kevin Ryan, USG. I actually just want to direct the earlier question at Julia. What can the resuspension models tell us about carbon burial in terms of the frequency of events and intensity? Can we use it to distinguish and predict what will happen to carbon burial in these systems?
Yes, I think that's something I haven't spent a lot of time on, but we can definitely do that. And so one of the neat things about coupling the sediment transport model like CSTMS with the biogeochemistry model is that you're accounting for different layers of the seabed. And so, I talked about the resuspension and the mobile sediments, but you're also getting deposition. And so what this approach does is you could, I think you would need data to do it well, but you could model, how much organic matter, not only how much organic matter is being suspended and remineralized, but also how much is not and is buried. And I think in addition, something that's interesting is how the characteristics of the organic matter are changing over time as that happens as well. So looking at the character, not just the magnitude of the depth deposits.
Blake Clark from NASA. Julia, kind of following up on that. So your sensitivity analysis showed that the remineralization rate was pretty sensitive to the settling velocity, but also the actual reactivity of the POC, right? So first of all, that's really interesting because those both can be linked to the molecular composition, in reality, and thus the source. So how might that change during these extreme events? And could that be accounted for with the current configuration of the model? And if not, then what is needed to actually account for that moving forward?
Yes, it could definitely change. No, I don't think we have the data to know. So, for example, I think one of the things I think about when you ask the question is the fact that you have this, really labile material that's, phytoplankton detritus settling out, right? So you're going to have more of that, even though most of a lot of it's neurons, you're going to have more of it initially, but as it's going to be probably more easily suspended than, for example, something coming in from the river that's really absorbed to inorganic particles. Sorry, I know I'm not answering all parts of your question, but yes, I would love to talk to people about how organic matter is transformed. So the one, I put one remineralization rate constant in there, but that is not realistic. That rate constant should change in response to environmental conditions, in response to the source of the organic matter. And I would love a way to go from biomarkers or isotopic data and environmental conditions to a remineralization rate constant, because it's a huge uncertainty in biogeochemical models, not just because of resuspension. And we don't know how to do it. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Neil Blair, Northwestern. So truly, my head's spinning as I'm thinking about your models because there's so much that we could do with this.
My head spins too.
So, are you able to replicate an actual fluidized bed with your model? In other words, like we see off the Amazon or the Gulf of Mexico?
There are short answers. No, we do not have a fluid modulator in there. And so that's also a big simplification. What we could do, there are ways to approach it, but some better than others. So no, is your short answer. So if you're counting for the reduced porosity, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking the numbers that you have, how much of the near bed oxygen consumption is by a hurricane, strike me as way too high. If you've ever actually seen the fluidized bed with all of these things, it's like they're persistent for months. And so it's would be unbelievable to me that one storm could come through and be tens of % of the remineralization of the seabed. You see how fluid these things are. So that's just something to think about. I think if you want something to model in the future, get the fluidized beds working, because I think they are really key to remineralizing the carbon process.
Sure. I mean, I would love to go there. But I will say, the Univ study, they were using observations to get a estimate of that, and they also got it 20%. And so I do think the model is overestimated compared to that, right? For sure. If I could go back in time and use some of that data information, if I could account for that. But one of the reasons we make the model open source is so that other people can do it too, right? So I encourage people to do that as well.
Hi, Ashley Norman, University of Colorado. I was wondering whether you could use contain in Cap C14 values of both the poor water and solid phase in your models or adapt your models to back out how much marine organic carbon is being remineralized versus terrestrial organic carbon in like a near shore.
Yes, I think we could. Yes. And I haven't looked at pore water data for that, but we use isotopic signatures in general to, so you Chesapeake Bay, we divided the material by source, like river material versus material produced in the estuary. And we did that using isotopic data. So I think what you're suggesting would be a follow-up, like a great follow-on on that and a way to test how we're doing it. But yes, that'd be great.
We still have some time. Any more questions? I have one. It's really interesting to see the global reach of fires and like in the Caribbean they've had a gas boom since 2012. That's a good call, an extreme event actually that's actually growing every year. And seeing those iron deposition rates, I think sargassum actually needs a lot of iron. And so that bloom in the Caribbean is actually fed by new sargassum kind of breeding ground that's in the tropical Atlantic. And so it would be very interesting to look at that as well.
Yeah, maybe I should just add a little bit of that. So I constantly get asked by the media whether or not we should do the iron fertilization experiments, whether we should carry on with this. And this is one really good reason why I'm like geoengineering first to feel maybe scale what Paul is about. But yeah, one of the particular things I think is we don't understand what the impacts of this is on hydrophobic levels, including sometimes you can end up with seaweed, and you could also end up with coral diebacks. There was a study which showed that the wildfires from the Indonesian region, when that changed, the ecosystem in the Indian Ocean was actually coral death. So there's a lot of complexity, and that's just about how it might respond to big changes in iron. That's a good example. One of them, but it's not always going to be good.
Trying to come and ask you for the International University. It's not really a question for Douglas, but it's more of a comment. Just I was snapping some images of your amazing figures among other people as well, because I can't remember all the information. But one of the things that strikes me about the fire history latitudinal gradient is just how not just the magnitude of the amount of carbon released or black carbon, but just the scale, latitudinal scale of which fire was occurring historically, and where it's occurring more punctuated now, like Amazon, etc. And just if you knew the sources or the landscape types that were probably burned, I'm guessing they were grasslands mostly, but do you know, and how does that factor into the things that you're doing with respect to fire and sources of marine fertilization?
Yeah, you're right. So one aspect of it absolutely is the savanna, Cerrado in South America, and it's not necessarily so. Humans absolutely increasing population creates more opportunity for ignitions, but that is not the end of the story. So when we're thinking about the integrated impact of fires, we want to know how large those fires were, the spread of those fires. So in savanna and grassland ecosystems, once you start a fire, it's very finely structured. It just goes up like a tinderbox. It can go on for like miles, and you're creating a massive amount of fire smoke. In fact, the vast majority of the fire emissions will come from Africa from these systems. And then what human activity over time is doing from pre-industrial to the present day is we are changing those savanna grasslands to agricultural and lands. So that's particularly seen in the last decades. For South America, but also very much now in the Sahel region as well. And that actually drives a global decline in burnt area. So although we have more intense fires happening in places like California and Australia, this is set against a backdrop actually of global decline in burnt areas still even now. And that's been driven by this change in human land use. And it's very much a grass problem. But also, just want to point, it's not always a grass problem. So in California, although again, talk about like the biggest fire areas and things like this, actually the amount of burnt area we've seen today could be still as low as 16% of the burnt area, which would naturally happen in that ecosystem if it wasn't for the extreme fire suppression that humans actually do. So it can be forest and land management as well.
Hi, Hans Perlow, UNC. I was just curious about your slide that had the productivity in it off Australia. How do you separate the baseline from any impacts that might occur from the fire in that slide? In other words, you know, there's probably a seasonal pattern out there. So how do you separate that from stimulation? I mean, I think that was the message in your slide, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do two simulations. One where we have so everything in the ocean state is exactly the same between the two simulations. The only difference is the input in the magnitude of aerosol being deposited to the ocean surface. And in one simulation, we have the dust and anthropogenic sources. And in the second simulation, we do the dust, anthropogenic, and the fire sources. And so by taking the difference of those two, you pass out what the impact of the fires is, because everything else is the same, particularly in terms of physics of the ocean and things like this. So all remains consistent. The only difference between the two is this additional fire aerosol deposition, and then from the difference, you can work out what the impacts are.